Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story: The Reflection in the Rain. Part 1. The Perfect Storm. Elliot had always loved the rain. As a freelance photographer, he found storms to be the most poetic of backdrops. Streets glistening with water, the world muted into shades of gray, and every drop carrying its own story. When the weather forecast predicted a rare, unrelenting downpour in the city, he packed his gear and headed out to capture what he hoped would be his masterpiece. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic patter of rain on concrete. Umbrellas swayed in the distance, their owners hurrying for shelter, but no one lingered. Elliot wandered through the city, letting the storm guide him. The rain came down in sheets, distorting his vision and lending a dreamlike quality to the world around him. He paused by an alley, captivated by a puddle that reflected the warm glow of a nearby street lamp. Its surface rippled gently as drops struck it, creating hypnotic patterns. Elliot crouched, adjusted his camera, and snapped a shot. The sound of the shutter echoed faintly, swallowed by the rain. Moving deeper into the city, he photographed empty parks, glistening storefronts, and the glimmer of wet cobblestones. Each puddle, each surface, seemed to tell its own story, a fleeting moment captured forever. As the hours passed, Elliot found himself on a deserted boulevard. The rain seemed heavier here, the air colder. A massive puddle stretched across the intersection, reflecting the looming silhouettes of nearby buildings. He snapped a photo and reviewed it on his camera screen. That's when he noticed it. In the center of the puddle, amidst the distorted reflections, stood a figure. It was barely distinguishable, a dark, shadowy outline, but it was there. The figure's head seemed tilted, as if it were staring directly at the lens. Elliot frowned. He was certain no one had been there when he took the photo. He glanced around, but the street was empty. Shaking off the unease creeping into his thoughts, he moved on, chalking it up to a trick of the light or an artifact in the image. By the time he returned to his small apartment, drenched and exhausted, the city had fallen silent. The rain continued to tap against the windows as he loaded the day's photos onto his computer. Image after image unfolded on the screen, each more striking than the last. But as he reviewed them, a chill ran down his spine. The figure wasn't just in the one photo. It was in every photo. Sometimes it stood by a lamppost, other times near the edge of a puddle or the corner of a building. In each image, it seemed to inch closer, always staring directly at the camera. Elliot's heart raced. He flipped through the photos faster, hoping to convince himself that his mind was playing tricks on him. But the figure was there, unmistakable, deliberate. With shaking hands, he highlighted all the photos and pressed delete. The images disappeared from the screen, replaced by the familiar blankness of his desktop. He exhaled, leaning back in his chair. The room was quiet except for the sound of the rain. But even as he tried to convince himself that it was over, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Part 2. reflections that follow. Elliot awoke to the faint light of dawn streaming through the rain-streaked window. The storm had subsided slightly, leaving behind a persistent drizzle. He rubbed his eyes, replaying the events of the night in his mind. The photographs, the figure. Surely it had all been a mistake, a figment of his tired imagination. Still, an uneasy feeling lingered. He grabbed his camera and checked its memory card. Nothing. The images were gone, as if they had never existed. Relieved but still unsettled, he decided to distract himself by heading to a local cafe to edit some older shots. The cafe was quiet, the kind of place where the hiss of the espresso machine blended seamlessly with the murmur of rain outside. Elliot set up his laptop and ordered a coffee, letting the normalcy of the morning soothe his nerves. As he scrolled through old photos, he caught a glimpse of something out of place. His heart skipped a beat as he zoomed in on a reflection in one of the images. A dark figure, partially obscured, standing in the corner of a puddle. This wasn't from yesterday's shoot. It was an older image, one he'd taken weeks ago. The figure hadn't been there before. Elliot quickly moved to the next photo, then the next. In every shot, no matter the location or time, the figure was there, always staring, always closer. He closed the laptop abruptly, his pulse racing. He glanced around the cafe, suddenly hyper-aware of the reflections around him. The glass windows, the polished floor, the puddles on the street outside. That's when he saw it. In the rain-soaked pavement just beyond the cafe store, a shadowy figure stood, perfectly still. Its head was tilted, just like in the photos. But this time it was unmistakable. Elliot froze, his breath caught in his throat. He forced himself to look away, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. When he dared to glance back, the figure was gone. Abandoning his coffee, he packed up and left the cafe, walking briskly through the rain. He didn't dare look at the reflections in the puddles or the windows of the shops he passed. The city felt different now. Colder, emptier, and filled with a presence he couldn't escape. By the time he reached his apartment, his clothes were soaked through, and his nerves were frayed. He locked the door behind him, drawing the curtains to block out the rain. Elliot sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his camera. He needed to understand what was happening. With a deep breath, he turned it on and began snapping pictures of his apartment, his desk, the kitchen, the hallway. When he reviewed the images, his stomach dropped. The figure was in every shot, closer than ever. It stood at the end of the hallway, then in the kitchen doorway, then right behind the chair in the living room. In the last photo, it loomed directly behind him, its dark silhouette blending into the shadows. A sudden knock at the door startled him, breaking the suffocating silence. The sound echoed through the apartment, loud and deliberate. Elliot didn't move. He didn't dare. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Part 3, into the reflection. The knocking grew louder, rattling the door in its frame. Elliot sat frozen, his camera slipping from his trembling hands onto the floor. "Who's there?" he finally managed to whisper, his voice barely audible over the relentless rain. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. For a moment, the only sound was his own ragged breathing. Then, faintly, he heard it, a wet, shuffling sound like bare feet moving across a soaked surface. Elliot's gaze darted to the small mirror hanging by the hallway. His blood ran cold. The figure was there, standing just beyond the reflection of the doorway. It didn't knock or speak. It simply stared, its head tilted unnaturally, as if studying him. Unable to tear his eyes away, Elliot stood and backed slowly into the living room. The figure didn't move, but its reflection in the mirror seemed to stretch closer, its edges rippling like water. In a desperate attempt to break free from the terror gripping him, Elliot turned and sprinted to the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind him. He leaned against it, heart pounding, the sound of the rain now muffled but unrelenting. The bathroom was small, but it felt suffocating in his panic. The only light came from the flickering bulb above the mirror. As Elliot caught his breath, he noticed the surface of the bathroom mirror begin to fog over, not from steam, but as if something unseen was breathing against it. He reached out with trembling fingers to wipe the glass, but before he could touch it, words began to form in a condensation. "You invited me." Elliot stumbled back, shaking his head. "No," he whispered. "I didn't invite anything." The mirror began to ripple like the surface of a puddle. The figure emerged in the reflection, its shape distorted yet unmistakably there. Its shadowy hand pressed against the glass, and as it did, the surface of the mirror began to stretch outward, bulging toward him as though it were trying to cross over. Elliot screamed and turned to flee, but the bathroom door wouldn't budge. The walls around him seemed to shimmer and bend, water pooling at his feet. The mirror cracked, a spider web of fractures spreading across its surface. And with a final, deafening shatter, the figure stepped through. It wasn't solid. It was a silhouette, a shadow soaked in the essence of the storm, dripping water onto the tiles. It tilted its head again, as if amused by Elliot's terror. Panicking, Elliot grabbed the camera hanging around his neck. With trembling hands, he snapped a photo, the flash illuminating the bathroom in a stark, blinding light. When the light faded, the figure was gone. The rain outside had stopped, leaving only a heavy stillness. Elliot collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The bathroom was empty, the mirror intact, as though nothing had happened. But when he looked down at the camera in his hands, the screen showed the last image he had taken. The figure was still there, standing right behind him, closer than ever. Its face, no longer a vague shadow, was now clear. It was his own face, twisted into a sinister, rain-soaked grin. The next morning, neighbors found Elliot's apartment eerily quiet. The door was unlocked, the furniture untouched. The only sign of him was his camera, sitting on the desk. The photos stored inside were haunting. Each one featured the figure, growing closer and closer until the final shot. A puddle in the empty apartment, perfectly reflecting the storm outside. No one ever saw Elliot again, but every time it rained, neighbors swore they could hear the faint click of a camera shutter, accompanied by the patter of footsteps just beyond their windows. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story: The Forgotten Raincoat. The evening was calm when the lone traveler wandered into the woods, their boots crunching softly against the fallen leaves. The horizon wore hues of amber and gray, hinting at an impending storm. They clutched their small backpack tightly, its contents barely enough to keep them warm if the rain arrived before they could find shelter. The woods were dense and quiet except for the distant sound of a babbling brook. Branches arched overhead, forming a natural canopy that barely let any light through. As the traveler walked deeper, they noticed something unusual: a bright, yellow raincoat hanging from a low branch. It swayed slightly in the breeze, its fabric still vibrant despite its seemingly forgotten state. The traveler paused, glancing around for any signs of someone nearby. There were none. No footprints, no rustling leaves, just the stillness of the woods and the ominous clouds gathering above. They approached the raincoat cautiously. "Strange place to leave this," they muttered. The storm clouds above rumbled a soft warning. Deciding it was better to be dry than question its origins, they shrugged and slipped the raincoat over their shoulders. The fit was snug, almost as if it had been made for them. A sudden gust of wind sent leaves swirling around, and as the first drops of rain began to fall, they pulled the hood up, grateful for its unexpected appearance. But as the rain intensified and thunder cracked in the distance, the traveler began to feel something peculiar. The raincoat felt heavier than it should have. A faint pressure pressed down on their shoulders, as if unseen hands rested there. They stopped under a large tree for shelter, trying to shake off the strange sensation. The rain poured relentlessly, creating a rhythmic patter against the leaves and the raincoat. And then, faintly at first, they heard it, a whisper. "Leave it behind," the voice said, almost lost amidst the rainfall. The traveler froze, heart pounding. They turned swiftly, their eyes scanning the surrounding woods, but there was no one. Only shadows and the ceaseless rain. "Who's there?" they called out, their voice trembling. No reply came, only the whispers growing louder with every passing moment. "Leave it behind." The traveler's pulse quickened as the whispers swirled around them, weaving into the sound of the rain. The weight on their shoulders grew more distinct, as though the raincoat itself had come alive. They tugged at the fabric, tempted to take it off, but the downpour showed no signs of relenting. "This is just my imagination," they muttered, trying to steady their breathing. "I'm tired, that's all." They pressed on through the woods, their path illuminated by sporadic flashes of lightning. Every so often, the whispers returned, clearer now. "Not yours. Belongs here. Leave it behind." The words seemed to echo from nowhere, and everywhere at once. The travelers stopped and glanced at the raincoat, brushing their hand over its smooth surface. It looked ordinary enough, yet the sense of unease refused to fade. Hours passed, or so it seemed, as they trudged through the ever-darkening forest. Despite the chill, they felt strangely warm, almost feverish. The raincoat clung tightly to them, as if unwilling to let go. At last, they came upon a clearing where an old cabin stood, half hidden beneath overgrown vines. The windows were dark, but the structure appeared stable. Desperate for shelter, the traveler approached and pushed the creaky door open. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the scent of moss. A lone table stood in the center of the room, with a single chair tipped on its side. The travelers set their bag down and collapsed into the chair, shaking off the rain from the hood. But as they did, a chill ran down their spine. The whispers had followed them inside. "Put it back." They froze, staring at the empty room. The whispers now sounded like a chorus, overlapping and insistent. The raincoat seemed heavier still, its fabric unnaturally warm against their skin. Suddenly, they noticed something odd on the table. A photograph, warped and yellowed with age. It depicted a young woman standing in the very clearing they had just crossed, her bright yellow raincoat unmistakable. The traveler's breath caught. The woman's face was serene, yet her eyes seemed to follow them, even in the faded print. Beneath the photo were scribbled words. "Take it, and it takes you too." The whispers grew louder, and the traveler clutched the edges of the raincoat, trying to shake off the rising panic. The pressure on their shoulders intensified, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as though arms were wrapped around them from behind, holding them in place. They scrambled to the window, peering out into the clearing. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the forest remained cloaked in darkness. Then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, they saw it, a figure standing still beneath the trees. It was draped in shadow, its shape indistinct, yet the traveler knew it was watching. And though the whispers continued to echo in their mind, the figure remained silent. The traveler backed away from the window, their breathing shallow as the figure lingered at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move, yet its presence was undeniable, a dark silhouette framed against the forest. The whispers seemed to ebb and flow, rising to a crescendo when the traveler glanced at the raincoat again. It clung to them like a second skin, the weight on their shoulders now unbearable. The photograph on the table caught their eye once more. This time, they noticed something they hadn't before. The woman in the raincoat wasn't alone. Behind her, barely visible in the shadowed forest, loomed a figure much like the one now watching from outside. A chill gripped the traveler's spine as the whispers merged into a single, urgent command. "Return it." Summoning all their courage, they tore the raincoat off and threw it to the floor. The oppressive weight lifted instantly, replaced by an eerie stillness. Yet the whispers didn't stop. Instead, they grew softer, as if retreating into the walls of the cabin. The traveler turned toward the door, but before they could make a move, the raincoat began to shift. Slowly, impossibly, it rose from the floor, the sleeves extending as though filled by invisible arms. The hood lifted, and the traveler could feel its eyeless gaze fixed on them. "Leave!" A voice boomed, low and resonant. It wasn't a whisper this time, but a command. Without a second thought, the traveler bolted from the cabin. The rain had all but stopped, yet the woods felt darker than ever. They ran blindly, branches scratching at their face and arms as they stumbled through the undergrowth. Behind them, they heard the soft rustle of fabric and a faint, rhythmic patter like footsteps. Desperate, they made their way back toward where they had first found the raincoat. When they reached the tree, they saw it, the branch where the raincoat had hung before. The whispers surged again, now pleading and frantic. "Put it back! Put it back!" Heart pounding, they turned to see the raincoat hovering inches away, its empty sleeves outstretched as though reaching for them. They grabbed it with trembling hands, sprinted to the tree, and flung it over the branch. As soon as it settled into place, the whispers ceased. The forest fell into a profound silence, broken only by the distant chirp of crickets. The traveler stepped back, staring at the raincoat as it swayed gently in the breeze. For a moment, they thought they saw a figure standing beneath it, translucent and faint, as if bidding them farewell. Then it was gone. Without looking back, they hurried out of the woods, vowing never to return. Days later, as they recounted their experience to a friend, the traveler hesitated. Would anyone believe them? They decided against mentioning the raincoat, but deep down, they knew they'd never forget the whispers, the weight, or the figure in the clearing. And every now and then, they'd wonder who had left the raincoat there, and who had been waiting to take it back. The end.